old socialist movement in New York, with its root in the Jewish unions, just at the moment when this movement was building its largest cooperative enterprise, when the socialist co-ops were reaching their full extent, some 40,000 units for 120,000 people, a very large thing. An alternative and competitive counterculture was arising in New York on the Lower East Side and nationally. And these two countercultures were completely at odds. The counterculture that's known as the 60s counterculture was plainly a throwback to the utopian movements that Hillquit had described in his History of Socialism in the United States in 1903. He described movements that were led by writers and novelists, sometimes communities and colonies that were often fragile because they were really dominated by literary ideas. And the same thing characterized now the counterculture of the radical counterculture of the 1960s, which was artistically very strong in beat poetry, certain kinds of rock music, offset printing, layout design, underground comics, all kinds of achievements like that, but was unable, for all its efforts to build communes and cooperatives that turned out to be stable, with a few exceptions that still survive. And so we ended up with a tremendous irony. The socialist cooperative housing movement had reached its height, but was failing because there was not a new generation to come in and take up those ideals. At the very moment when there was a mass counterculture building communes and cooperatives which wanted nothing to do with the old socialists. It's heartbreaking to think of it. Obviously, if you remember back to those times, you understand intuitively that there was no possible connection between the two, that aesthetically they were different, that the old socialists cooperatives were modernist. They wanted high-rises, and the 60s counterculture was nostalgic. It wanted to live in tenements or 19th century farms, or brownstones at best. And there was no way to bring these. There was no way to bring these together. And yet, one of the tragic or sad consequences of 60s counterculture was to absorb the very generation that might have allowed the other to prosper. Today, there is a house on an apartment house, a large apartment house on the Lower East Side, named for Morris Hillquit, but it's no longer run on socialist principles, so the apartments are on the free market. Will there be further such movements in the future? Hillquit's book, read in the light of 100 years later, would makes plain that of course there will. This is the nature of American life to generate such movements. Will these movements involve the Jews? Will there be Jewish movements of this sort? I don't know.